Right now, somewhere on a motorway near you, a car is changing gear. The driver feels nothing. No whine, no shudder, just a clean shift and the road unspooling ahead. Inside that gearbox are gears finished to a tolerance thinner than a human hair, and there is a strong chance they were ground on a machine built by a single Swiss company most people have never heard of. Reishauer, pronounced Reishauer, of Wallisellen, just outside Zurich, has spent more than 200 years making the tools that make the parts that move the world. It survived a world war and an industrial collapse that buried its rivals. But the fight that nearly tore it apart came from inside its own boardroom. This is Trade Archive, where the machines that built the modern world finally get the story they deserve. If industrial history told like a war room briefing is your kind of thing, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It is the one thing that decides whether stories like this one keep getting made. So why did a gear grinder ever matter enough to fight over? Let's go back to a workshop in Zurich in the spring of 1788, long before there were cars, or transmissions, or gears worth grinding. The old town of Zurich, then, was a maze of guild houses along the river, each trade jealously guarded, each craftsman answering to a brotherhood that decided who was allowed to work and who was not. On the 31st of March that year, a toolsmith named Hans Jakob Däniker was accepted as a master into one of those Zurich guilds, and he opened a small forge of his own. He made cutting tools by hand, files, chisels, the unglamorous iron of a working city. There was nothing about that forge to suggest it would outlive empires. The name Reishauer arrives through a side door, the way a lot of dynasties actually begin. A young man named Johann Gottfried Reishauer came to work in the Däniker forge, learned the trade at the anvil, and then did the thing that quietly changes the ownership of a business forever. He married into the family. When the old master's era ended, Gottfried took the workshop over in 1824 and put his own name above the door. From that point, the company carried the Reishauer name, and it carried something else too, a specific obsession that would define it for the next 200 years. Not making things, making the things that measure and cut other things. The tools behind the tools. Through the middle of the 19th century, that obsession sharpened into a specialty. As Europe industrialized, factories needed screws, and screws needed threads, and threads needed to be identical from one workshop to the next, or nothing fit together. Reishauer moved into thread-cutting tools and, crucially, into thread gauges, the master references against which a thread was judged correct or scrap. By 1870, the business was formally registered as a tool factory in Zurich, its benches lined with taps and dies, and the delicate steel gauges that told a manufacturer whether his work was any good. A thread gauge is a humble-looking object, a hardened steel plug or ring cut with a perfect thread, and its entire value is that it never lies. A factory across the country could check its own screws against a gauge like this and trust that a part made in one city would mesh with a part made in another. That trust is what industry runs on, and Reishauer was quietly appointing itself the keeper of it. It was building a culture in which the difference between correct and almost correct was the difference between a business and a scrap heap. In 1882, it became a share company, raising outside money, and it added ever more precise gauges to its range. That word, precise, is the whole plot. Reishauer was becoming a company whose entire reason to exist was being more accurate than everyone else. And accuracy, it turned out, has no ceiling. There is always a finer tolerance to chase, and chasing it would eventually break the company out of the tool-making trade entirely and into building machines. Here is where the story turns, and it turns because of a problem the company created for itself. By the late 1920s, Reishauer was making thread gauges so exacting that the machines available to grind them were no longer good enough. The commercial thread grinders on the market simply could not hold the standard Reishauer had set for its own products. Most firms would have accepted the limit. Reishauer refused. In 1928, the company built its own thread grinding machine, the first actual machine tool it had ever produced in 140 years of existence. It was a workshop solving its own bottleneck, and it worked. Within a few years, the company was grinding taps from solid hardened steel and selling those machines to others. But that first machine handed Reishauer a second, deeper problem, and the second problem is the one that made history. A thread grinding machine is only as accurate as the gears inside it, the index gears that set the pitch of the thread as the workpiece turns. Reishauer went looking for gears accurate enough to drive its own machines and discovered that no one on Earth made them well enough. The gears you could buy were too rough, too imprecise, riddled with tiny errors that printed themselves onto every thread the machine cut. The company that had built a machine to escape one limit had run straight into another. To make a truly accurate machine, they needed truly accurate gears. And to make truly accurate gears, they were going to have to invent a way to finish gears that did not yet exist. That work began in the 1930s, and the timing could not have been worse. For roughly 15 years, spanning the entire Second World War, a team of Reishauer engineers ground away at the problem inside the Wallisellen factory, while the continent outside came apart. Switzerland was neutral, but neutrality on a map meant very little on the ground. The country was landlocked and, by 1940, almost completely surrounded by the Axis. Raw materials were rationed. Steel was scarce. Every shipment across a border was a negotiation, and the threat of invasion sat over the whole nation like weather. Outside the factory gates, a continent burning through the deadliest conflict in human history. Inside, a handful of Swiss engineers bent over drawings and test rigs, arguing about microns. The gap between the scale of the catastrophe and the scale of their obsession is almost absurd, and it is exactly that gap that makes the achievement land. They were trying to grind a gear more perfectly than anyone ever had, in the middle of the apocalypse. The work itself demanded a kind of stillness the outside world had completely lost. You cannot rush a machine that measures its success in fractions of a hair. You test, you fail, you adjust, you test again, for months and then years, while the newspapers on the workbench carry the maps of the war moving closer. Every batch of steel that did make it across a guarded border had to be argued for, accounted for, and made to count, because there might not be another. There is a discipline in that no crisis can manufacture on demand. Reishauer had spent 150 years building exactly that discipline, and the war became the strangest possible test of it. The name most closely tied to the breakthrough in the surviving records is an engineer named Alfred Rickenmann of Küsnacht near Zurich, whose work appears on the founding patents Reishauer filed for a new kind of grinding machine, the earliest of them lodged with a Swiss priority date in 1940 as the war closed in. The company itself has always credited the achievement to its engineers as a group rather than to one man, and that is probably the honest way to tell it. What matters is the result. In 1945, the same year the war finally ended, Reishauer unveiled a machine it called the ZA. It was, by the accepted account, the world's first machine that could grind gears in a single continuous motion, and it did something no gear grinder had done before. Why was it so revolutionary? Well, you'd have to understand how gears were finished before 1945, because the old way was agony. A hardened gear had to be ground one tooth gap at a time. The grinding wheel would descend into a single space between two teeth, grind it, lift out, and then the whole gear would rotate, or index, to present the next gap. Grind, lift, index, repeat, tooth after tooth after tooth, for every gear. It was slow, it was expensive, and every one of those thousands of tiny indexing movements was another chance to introduce an error. Grinding a hardened gear to a high standard was a luxury, reserved for the parts that absolutely demanded it. The Reishauer method threw that entire logic away. Instead of a disc that ground one gap at a time, Reishauer used a grinding wheel shaped like a giant threaded screw, what engineers call a worm. That threaded wheel meshed with the gear exactly the way a worm meshes with a gear in an ordinary machine, and then both spun together in perfect synchronization, the wheel and the workpiece locked in a mechanical dance. As they turned, the abrasive thread of the wheel swept across every tooth on the gear at once, continuously, without ever stopping to index. 3 movements happened together. The wheel fed in to set the depth of the cut. It traveled down the length of the gear to grind the full width of the teeth, and it shifted sideways as it went, a small lateral creep, so that fresh, sharp abrasive was always meeting the steel instead of a dull, worn patch of wheel. There was no lost time between teeth because there were no gaps in the process at all. A gear that once took a long, careful sequence of separate grinds could now be finished in as little as 2 passes. 1 rough, 1 fine, done. In its launch brochure for the ZA, Reishauer made a prediction that reads today like a company staring directly into the future. It said, in effect, that in the years to come, gears would be ground that could not be ground economically in 1945, even though it would already be better to grind them if only the cost allowed. That is precisely what happened. The Reishauer method made it cheap enough and fast enough to grind hardened gears in volume. And that single capability is the hidden foundation under the entire post-war automobile. Every quiet, durable automatic transmission that would fill the world's driveways in the decades ahead depended on gears finished to a standard that, before the ZA, was simply too expensive to bother with. What made Reishauer more than a clever idea, though, was that the company built almost the entire machine itself, and it built it to a standard of rigidity most competitors could not match. A gear grinder is a paradox of engineering. It has to be massive and immovable because the slightest vibration prints itself onto the finished tooth as a defect you can hear later as a whine, and yet the moving parts inside it have to dance together with more precision than a watch. The heavy cast bases that anchored these machines had to be poured, left to settle and stress relieve, and then machined dead flat and dead true. Because a base that shifts by a fraction over its lifetime turns every gear it grinds into a reject. The spindles that spun the grinding worm had to run without a flicker of wobble, balanced and seated so precisely that they could hold speed for hours without printing their own tiny imperfections onto the steel. And the synchronization between wheel and workpiece, in those early decades, was maintained by the machine's own internal gear trains, precise gears meshing with precise gears to keep the whole system locked in step. There is a beautiful loop hidden in that. Reishauer had gone into gear grinding in the first place because it needed better gears for its own machines. Now its grinding machines were themselves full of the very gears only a Reishauer machine could produce to that standard. The company was, in a real sense, building the machines that built its machines. With the ZA proven, Reishauer spent the next several decades doing what great engineering companies do. It refined, it scaled, and it slowly took the human being out of the loop. In 1968 came the AZA, the first real step toward automation, a machine designed so that a single operator could tend several of them at once, instead of standing over one. That mattered less for prestige than for economics. Every second a machine sat idle waiting for a person was a second of lost money, and lowering the cost per gear opened up whole new markets. Trucks, tractors, pumps, printing presses. Anything that turned and meshed and needed to run quietly could now afford ground gears. Then, in 1977, Reishauer made a leap that quietly ended one era and began another. It launched the RZ300E, and the E was the whole point. That machine replaced the mechanical gear trains that had always synchronized the grinding wheel and the workpiece with an electronic gearbox. Instead of physical gears meshing to keep everything in step, an electronic control now held the two motions in perfect coordination. The precision jumped again, far enough that these machines became trusted for aerospace work, where a gear failing is not a warranty claim, it is a crash. And there is a quiet irony buried in that machine, the kind the best stories leave for you to notice. For half a century, the accuracy of a Reishauer grinder had depended on the flawless internal gears the company took such pride in. The RZ300E made those internal gears unnecessary. Electronics had done what mechanism no longer needed to. The very thing that had launched the whole enterprise had, at last, been engineered out of it. That should have been the story of a company on a smooth upward curve. It was not, because the world that Reishauer had grown up in was about to fall apart around it. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the entire Swiss machine tool industry walked into a crisis that would kill most of the companies caught in it. For decades after the war, Swiss precision engineering had ruled almost unchallenged, its quality a byword, its order books full. Then, the ground shifted. Cheaper, faster manufacturing rose in Asia and started taking the volume work. The oil shocks hammered industrial demand. And a technological revolution arrived that many old Swiss firms simply could not make. The shift from purely mechanical machines to computer numerical control, the world of software and servo motors and code, where a machine's brain mattered as much as its castings. Firm after historic firm, names that had been fixtures of Swiss engineering for generations, went bankrupt, got swallowed, or vanished. It was, for the industry, a slaughter. Reishauer survived it, and the way it survived tells you exactly what kind of company it had become. It did not try to be everything. It went the other way. It walked away from general toolmaking, the very trade it had been founded on back in Däniker's forge, and it bet everything on the one thing almost nobody else in the world could do as well: continuous generating gear grinding. It forced its own mechanical engineers, men who had spent careers thinking in cams and linkages, to learn electronics and control code, to become the people who built machines like the RZ300E instead of being replaced by them. It was a brutal, do-or-die narrowing of the whole enterprise. Bet the company on a niche so deep and so defensible that the flood of cheap competition could not reach it. That gamble is the reason Reishauer is still here, and most of its old neighbors are memorials. When the water rose, it climbed onto the one rock high enough to matter. By the time that crisis passed, the modern Reishauer had taken shape, and its machines came in a steady march of new models through the following decades. The RZ301S in the 1980s. The RZ362A in the early 1990s, the first grinder purpose built for the punishing volumes of the car industry. The RZ150 in the early 2000s, which introduced twin spindle technology, a trick so simple and so effective, it is almost unfair. The machine has two work spindles. While one gear is being ground, the second spindle is already being unloaded and reloaded with the next blank, so the grinding wheel almost never stops working. On automotive pinions, that dropped the time to finish a single gear to under 10 seconds. And the RZ1000, a giant of a machine built to grind gears up to a meter across, the kind that go into wind turbines and heavy industry. Underneath all those models ran a philosophy the company came to call its circle of competence, and it is the reason a Reishauer machine grinds the way it does. Somewhere along the line, Reishauer's engineers realized that the machine was only ever as good as everything touching the workpiece, and much of that was bought from outside suppliers who did not understand the process. A mediocre grinding wheel or a generic dressing tool would hold back even a perfect machine. So Reishauer decided to make all of it in-house. In 1998, it began producing its own diamond dressing tools, the precision tools that carve and maintain the shape of the grinding worm itself. In 2008, it opened its own fully automated grinding wheel factory in Pfaffenau, in the canton of Lucerne, where the abrasive worms are built and then fired for several days on a carefully controlled temperature curve that peaks just below 1,000 degrees, a process most of the industry still did partly by hand. In 2012, it added its own work holding, the clamping fixtures that hold each gear dead center, accurate to within about 3 microns as parts change over. Machine, wheel, dressing tool, clamping, automation. all of it developed and built under one roof. By the count Reishauer gives, more than 80% of the entire system is made in-house. When something goes wrong at that level of precision, there is no supplier to blame and no supplier who can fix it. There is only Reishauer, controlling every variable that could put a flaw into a tooth. In 2010, the company extended that same logic beyond its own walls. It bought a German automation firm called Felsamat, based in the southwest of Germany, a company founded in 1981 that had made its name building compact cells to handle small gears without damaging them. The purchase turned Reishauer from a maker of grinding machines into something closer to a full systems builder, able to take a raw steel blank and carry it through cutting, chamfering, and grinding in one connected flow at the pace of seconds. Reishauer no longer just sold you the machine that ground the gear. It could sell you the whole line that turned a lump of steel into a finished, silent transmission gear, and increasingly, it built those lines wherever the car industry was booming, including a major expansion into China. And that, on paper, is a clean story. 2 centuries of relentless precision, a wartime breakthrough, a survived crisis, a global near monopoly on one of the most demanding processes in all of manufacturing. Except the cleanest-looking companies often hide the ugliest fights, and the ugliest fight in Reishauer's history was not with a rival or a recession. It was a civil war among its own owners, and it ran for the better part of 20 years. On one side stood the Bodmer family, old Zurich money in the most literal sense. The Bodmer name is woven into the private bank Rahn and Bodmer, one of the oldest private banks in the city, with roots reaching back to the middle of the 18th century, older even than Däniker's forge. This was a patrician family, established, discreet, the kind that sits on boards and does not raise its voice. The Bodmers controlled a majority of Reishauer, somewhere around 53%, and through it, they controlled the board and, in effect, the company. On the other side stood a man who was almost the exact opposite of everything the Bodmers represented. Adrian Gasser was a self-made Swiss businessman, combative, loud, unafraid of a courtroom, a man who had built a sprawling holding empire out of the wreckage of the old Swiss textile industry through his company Loers. Gasser had bought his way into Reishauer until he held around 47% of it. Not a majority, but very nearly half. In almost any company on Earth, a man holding 47% is a power you have to reckon with, a partner you bring to the table. Inside Reishauer, Gasser was frozen out completely, and the way he was frozen out is the heart of the drama. Reishauer's shares were what Swiss law calls restricted registered shares, a mechanism that lets a company's board decide who gets entered into the share register with full voting rights and who does not. When Gasser moved to consolidate his holdings, the board simply refused to register his shares the way he wanted, using that legal lever to strip a man who owned nearly half the company of the influence that ownership should have carried. Imagine buying 47% of a business and being told, in effect, that your money bought you nothing, that the doors to the room where decisions were made would stay shut. Gasser did not accept it. He went to war. What followed was a decade and more of lawsuits, and Gasser's central accusation was explosive. He claimed the Reishauer board, the Bodmer establishment, was running the company as a private preserve, deliberately obscuring how profitable it really was, using accounting that hid the true health of the business so that the wealth flowed to the majority owners rather than to shareholders like him. He accused them of leaning on a compliant auditor to keep the picture cloudy. And in one of the strangest inventions in Swiss corporate history, Gasser created a financial instrument he named, mockingly, the Bodmerschein, pronounced Bodmerschein, the Bodmer certificate, a device built specifically to put financial pressure on the family and to turn his frozen, unusable stake into leverage. He named his weapon after his enemy. The astonishing part is that the courts, in significant measure, agreed with him. This was not a nuisance suit swatted away. The Zurich Commercial Court found that the company's accounting had indeed been kept in a way the law did not permit, and that the auditor had not been the independent check it was supposed to be. The fight climbed all the way to the Swiss Federal Supreme Court, the highest court in the country. And in a judgment handed down in early 2013, 5 members of the Reishauer leadership were held personally liable and ordered to pay 1.2 million Swiss francs in damages back to the company. Over the costs of a legal battle, the courts decided they never should have waged. For a patrician Zurich establishment that prized its discretion above almost everything, being named, judged, and ordered to pay by the nation's highest court was a humiliation of a very particular and very public kind. Gasser did not win everything. He pushed, at the extreme, to have the company broken up and liquidated. And there the courts drew a line, ruling that dissolving a company is a last resort, an instrument for situations that are truly unbearable, and this, however poisonous, did not meet that bar. So the war ended not with a verdict, but with exhaustion, the way most 20-year wars do. Around 2014 and 2015, a settlement took shape. Gasser, through Lours, agreed to sell his roughly 47% stake back out, at a valuation that put each Reishauer share at about 60,000 Swiss francs. A staggering number that told its own story about just how valuable the company both sides had been fighting over really was. The financier, Martin Ebner, helped provide the venue for the shares to change hands. And after 2 decades of briefs and hearings and mutual loathing, the man who had held nearly half of Reishauer finally let it go, and the Bodmer camp was left holding the company it had defended so ferociously. There is a line Gasser was fond of, a piece of his own philosophy, that without honor a man cannot do business. Read against the story of Reishauer, it cuts more than one way. He believed he had been denied his honor as an owner, robbed of the standing his stake should have bought. The family on the other side believed they were defending a company and a way of doing business against an outsider who did not belong. Both of them, in the end, were fighting over the same thing: control of a quiet machine builder in a Zurich suburb that the wider world had never even heard of, and that was, precisely because it was so obscure and so dominant, worth an absolute fortune. With the war finally behind it, Reishauer walked into the era it had been preparing for all along, almost without knowing it. The world began switching from combustion engines to electric ones, and that switch turned out to play directly to Reishauer's oldest strength. A petrol engine is loud, and its noise masks everything. An electric motor is nearly silent, which means the faint whine of gears meshing, the sound no one ever noticed before, is suddenly the most annoying thing in the car. Electric drivetrains also spin faster and pull harder, which makes that whine worse. The entire electric vehicle industry now needed gears ground to a standard of quiet and precision that, not long ago, would have seemed impossible. And there stood a company that had spent 70 years doing nothing but grinding gears to impossible standards. Reishauer answered with software running inside the grinding process itself. One technique, called low-noise shifting, deliberately introduces tiny, controlled irregularities into the surface of each tooth so the gear does not sing out at a single tormenting frequency, breaking up the whine before it can start. Another, twist control grinding, shapes each tooth so that when it is loaded under real torque and flexes, it flexes into the correct shape rather than out of it, which lets a gearbox be made smaller and lighter for the same strength, which in an electric car means more range. And to guarantee all of this at the speed of mass production, Reishauer built a monitoring system called Argus that listens to the grinding process in real time, using sound and vibration to judge the quality of every single gear as it is made, catching a bad one before it can ever reach a gearbox. That system feeds a cloud that, by the middle of 2023, had gathered data from around 21 million individual grinding cycles, a swarm of machines quietly teaching each other to grind better. The reward was a boom. As the electric vehicle build-out peaked, Reishauer's order books filled with it, and in 2023 the group posted a record operating result. the fruit of 2 centuries of chasing a finer tolerance than anyone else would bother with. And then, just as quickly, the electric vehicle surge cooled, the industry pulled back its investment, and the same company that had ridden the wave up felt it recede, with the automation side of the business pushed into reorganization. Leadership changed hands, with Alex Wazer taking over as chairman in 2024. Though the Bodmer name remained at the table, the family that had won its war still watching over the company it had refused to give up. The shares, traded quietly off-market, only climbed higher. So what is Reishauer in the end? It is a company that began as a hand forge in 18th century Zurich and became the invisible foundation under nearly every automatic transmission on Earth. It solved a problem it created for itself, perfected the solution in the middle of a world war, and survived a crisis that erased almost everyone around it by refusing to be anything other than the best in the world at one impossibly narrow thing. Its worst wounds were self-inflicted, delivered by its own owners in a courtroom rather than by any competitor. And through all of it, the 230-year fixation never changed. Be more accurate than everyone else. Control every variable. Grind the tooth so perfectly that the driver, changing gear on a motorway somewhere, feels absolutely nothing at all. That silence, the silence you never notice, is the whole point. It is the sound of a Swiss company that spent 2 centuries making sure you would never have to think about it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to Trade Archive, and the video on screen right now digs into another industrial empire most people have forgotten about. Go watch it.